I want to begin with something that took me longer to understand than it should have, given how consistently I observed it across the full length of my clinical career. I want to begin with what silence does, not the silence of indifference, not the silence of a person who has nothing to say or no investment in the connection that their quiet is leaving unfilled. The specific and particular silence of a woman who has been communicating steadily, consistently, with the full and largely unacknowledged generosity of a person who has been showing up in words when the other person's showing up in reality has been sufficient, and who has stopped, not gradually, not with the trailing off that allows the recipient to adjust slowly and unconsciously to the reduction in contact, completely. The messages that arrived with a regularity he had absorbed into the background architecture of his daily experience simply ceased. The name that appeared in his notifications with a frequency he had stopped consciously registering because it had become part of the atmospheric furniture of his ordinary life went quiet, and the quiet changed everything. I do not use that phrase with the looseness that it is sometimes used in popular discourse, where everything changes with a frequency that drains the word of its meaning. I use it with the full clinical precision that 40 years of sitting inside the interior worlds of men who had experienced exactly this change taught me to bring to it. Something structural shifted in his interior the moment her silence became real. Something that had been organized around the continuous presence of her communication, around the steady stream of her words and her attention, and her willingness to maintain the connective tissue of the relationship through the labor of her language, was suddenly required to exist without the scaffolding that labor had been providing, and the requirement revealed, with the particular and unsparing clarity that only genuine absence produces, exactly how much of the structure had been hers all along. He had not known he was being held up. That is the observation I want to press upon you before we go any further, because it is the foundation on which everything else I intend to say rests. He had not known, in the conscious and articulable sense that would have allowed him to acknowledge it or respond to it or make any kind of deliberate decision about it, that her communication had been doing structural work in his interior. He had experienced it as pleasant, as the comfortable texture of a connection that was functioning, as evidence arriving without his having to produce any corresponding evidence of his own, that the relationship was alive and that he was valued within it, and that the question of whether she was still there, still oriented toward him, still holding him in the active center of her attention, did not require his conscious engagement because her words were answering it continuously and automatically without any effort on his part to keep the answer coming. Her silence removed the automatic answer, and the question, deprived of its continuous and effortless resolution, surfaced in his interior with an insistence that the comfortable machinery of his daily life discovered it was not equipped to quietly absorb, because the question was not, at its deepest and most honest level, and simply whether she was still there. That was the surface form of the question, the form it took when the conscious mind, which prefers manageable formulations, attempted to contain it. The deeper form, the form in which it actually lived in the part of his interior that the persona had never successfully reached, was older and considerably more destabilizing than a simple inquiry about her current emotional availability. The deeper question was what her silence meant about him. I developed, across the middle and later periods of my career, a concept that I consider among the most important contributions my work made to the understanding of intimate connection. I called it the anima, the internalized feminine, the archetypal image of the woman that lives in every man's interior, constructed from the accumulated experience of every encounter with the feminine across the full length of his life, beginning in the earliest and most formative experiences before conscious memory has developed the organizational capacity to file them in any rational order. The anima is not a specific woman, it is a pattern, a living image, a composite that the psyche assembles and that the psyche projects, with the enthusiastic imprecision of an interior that has been waiting for the right external surface to cast it onto the real women who enter a man's life, carrying enough of the pattern's features to make the projection feel like recognition. He had projected his anima onto her. This is not a criticism of him. It is a description of a process so universal in masculine psychology that I would be more surprised to encounter a man in whom it had not occurred than one in whom it had. The projection happened, as these projections always happen, below the level of his conscious participation. He did not decide to see in her the features of his internalized feminine image. He simply encountered her, and the anima recognized something, and the recognition produced the particular quality of aliveness and significance that attaches itself to the person onto whom the projection has landed with sufficient accuracy to feel from the inside like the most real thing he has ever felt. And her communication had been feeding the projection. Every message she sent, every word that arrived in his notifications carrying the texture of her particular and irreplaceable voice, every exchange that confirmed her continued presence and her continued orientation toward him had been at the level of the anima, providing the external input that kept the projected image vivid and immediate and alive in his interior. He had not been relating only to her. He had been relating to her through the anima, and the anima had been using her words, her attention, her consistent communicative presence as the raw material from which it continuously reconstructed and refreshed the projected image that had become. Without his conscious authorization of the arrangement, one of the primary sources of meaning and aliveness in his interior life. And then the raw material stopped arriving, and the anima, deprived of its continuous external supply, was left alone in the silence with the projection, with an image that was no longer being refreshed by her actual presence and was therefore beginning, in the way that all projections begin when the external surface that has been sustaining them is withdrawn, to do something that neither his persona nor his conscious mind had any prepared response for. It was beginning to crack, and in the cracking, something was being revealed about the space between the projected image and the real woman he had been relating to through it, a space that her continuous communication had been papering over with such consistency and such thoroughness that he had never been required to look directly at it, never been required to ask whether what he was experiencing in the connection was her, genuinely and completely her, or the anima's version of her, dressed in enough of her actual features to make the distinction feel unnecessary. The silence was making the distinction feel necessary, and what he found when he was finally required to make it was not what he had expected to find, not what the comfortable machinery of the projection had been allowing him to assume he would find if he ever looked closely enough to see it. What he found was the beginning of something that his interior had been, without his conscious knowledge or consent, waiting for the silence to force into the light. Stay with me. If what I have offered here has already begun to illuminate something you have felt, but not yet had the language to articulate about what your silence produced in him, share this with someone who is considering going quiet and has not yet understood what that quiet will do in the interior of the man receiving it. Follow along. Because what I observed in the men who came to me in the aftermath of a woman's silence, the precise mechanism of what it activated, the specific interior confrontation it forced, and what it changed permanently in the way he understood both her and himself, is what we are going to examine next with the full honesty it deserves. I want to tell you about a man I treated in the final decade of my active clinical practice whose case illuminated, with a precision that I found both instructive and quietly devastating, the specific interior process that a woman's silence initiates in a man who has been relating to her primarily through the anima projection rather than through the genuine and unmediated encounter with who she actually is beneath it. He was a man in his early 40s, intelligent in the way that men who have invested heavily in the intellectual dimensions of their persona tend to be intelligent, broadly, impressively, and with a particular facility for articulating complex ideas about the external world that existed in striking contrast to his almost complete absence of vocabulary for the internal one. He had, as I observed in our first several sessions, an entire sophisticated architecture of thought available to him for the analysis of everything outside his own interior, and almost nothing available to him for the analysis of what lived within it. He came to me not because of the silence. He came to me because of what the silence had produced in him that he could not, through any of the considerable intellectual resources at his disposal, adequately explain or manage. He described it in our second session as a haunting, not in the supernatural sense, though I never dismissed the supernatural with the confidence that some of my more rigorously rationalist colleagues brought to that dismissal. In the psychological sense, the sense of a presence that persisted in the interior after the external circumstances that had produced it had changed. She had gone silent. The communication had stopped. By every rational measure available to his considerable analytical mind, the situation was clear. A woman had ceased contact. The appropriate response, by the logic of his persona, was to register the cessation, make whatever adjustment to his expectations the cessation required, and continue forward with the business of his life. His persona had managed more significant disruptions than this with considerably less difficulty. The persona was discovering that this disruption was not cooperating, because the haunting was not responding to the persona's management. It was not diminishing with the passage of time in the way that the rational mind assured him it should. If anything, it was intensifying. Her silence was louder in his interior, more present, more insistently demanding of his attention than her communication had ever been. And the paradox of that, the fact that her absence was more audible than her presence had been, was producing in him a quality of interior confusion that his intellectual architecture had no adequate framework for resolving. I knew immediately what was happening. The anima projection, deprived of the external input that had been keeping it oriented toward the real woman, had turned inward. It had, in the absence of her actual words and her actual presence, and the continuous stream of her actual communication, begun to operate entirely within the interior, constructing and reconstructing her image from the available internal material, replaying the archive of every exchange, every word, every texture of her particular communicative presence that had been absorbed and stored in the interior during the period of contact, and doing so with an intensity and a vividness that the actual ongoing communication had never produced, because the actual ongoing communication had been too immediate and too continuous to require the interior to actively generate her presence. She had simply been there, arriving in his notifications, requiring nothing of his interior in the way of construction or effort now. She was not there, and the interior was discovering, in her absence, how much of its available energy it was capable of directing toward the generation of her presence from within. The anima had taken over the project of her maintenance in his interior life with a thoroughness that was crowding out the ordinary functioning of his daily psychology. He was, in the most precise clinical sense I can apply to it, more occupied with her in her silence than he had ever been in her communication, and the occupation was not comfortable. It was not the warm and sustaining occupation of a man who is contentedly in love. It was the restless and compulsive occupation of an interior that has lost its external reference point and is spinning with increasing urgency and decreasing rational oversight in the space where the reference point used to be. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to bring to it the same undefended honesty that my patient was being slowly, session by session, invited to bring to his own interior examination. When you went silent, when you stopped sending the messages and stopped maintaining the communicative thread, and allowed the quiet to settle between you with the completeness that genuine silence requires, did you anticipate the weight of what your silence would carry in his interior? Not strategically, not in the calculating sense of a person who has engineered a silence for its effect, but genuinely. Did you understand, in the moment of going quiet, that the absence of your words would be louder in him than their presence had been, that the silence would do something in his interior that the communication, for all its warmth and consistency and genuine investment, had never been able to do? Write in the comments what you understood in that moment, what you felt in yourself when the quiet settled and you allowed it to remain, because what you find in that feeling tells you something important, not only about the silence, but about what the communication had been costing you, that the silence finally, in its own quiet way, began to return. Because here is what I told my patient across the sessions that followed his initial description of the haunting. I told him that the haunting was not a malfunction. It was not the irrational persistence of an attachment that his rational mind had correctly identified as concluded. It was the anima doing precisely what the anima does when the external surface of its projection is withdrawn. It was turning the full force of its interior generativity toward the reconstruction of what had been lost. And in the turning, in the compulsive and restless reconstruction. It was revealing something about the nature of his connection to her that the comfortable continuity of her communication had been allowing him to avoid seeing. It was revealing how little of what he had been experiencing as connection had actually been connection with her. How much of it had been connection with the anima's version of her, with the projection, with the image he had constructed and maintained and related to through the medium of her words without ever being required, because her words kept arriving with the regularity of a supply that never interrupted, to examine the distance between the image and the woman, between what the anima had decided she was and what she actually was in the full and irreducible complexity of her real interior. Her silence had collapsed that distance, not by bringing him closer to her real self, by removing the external input that had been allowing the projection to feel like reality. And in the removal, the interior was left alone with something it had been successfully avoiding for the entire duration of the connection. Something that the haunting was circling with the compulsive urgency of a system that has encountered a truth it cannot process through its ordinary channels, and cannot, no matter how sophisticated its management protocols, successfully avoid. The truth was this: he did not know her. Not in the way he had assumed he knew her. Not in the way that the comfortable continuity of their communication had allowed him to feel he knew her. He knew the anima's version of her. He knew the projection that her presence had been sustaining. And the projection, now that the sustaining had stopped, was revealing itself as a projection with a clarity that the silence was making it impossible to look away from. And what looking at it directly was requiring of him was something that his entire psychological formation had been constructed to make unnecessary. It was requiring him to ask who she actually was. Not the image, not the anima's construction, the real woman, the one whose silence was proving, in its weight and its persistence and its refusal to behave the way his rational mind assured him an absence should behave, that she had always been more than the projection, that there had always been a real interior behind the words, an actual and irreducible person whose full reality he had been relating to through the comfortable medium of the anima's version of her, without ever being required to encounter it directly. The silence was the direct encounter, and what it was demanding of him in that encounter was the thing that his interior had been without his conscious awareness of the waiting for the silence to force into the open. We are going there in our final conversation. And I want you to arrive there, understanding not only what the silence produced in him, but what it was always asking of both of you, that the communication, for all its genuine warmth and investment, had been making it possible to defer. The direct encounter that her silence forced upon him was not comfortable. I want to establish clearly before I describe what it produced, because the discomfort is not incidental to the story. It is the story. The discomfort is the mechanism through which everything that the silence changed in him actually changed. Because genuine interior change, in my clinical experience across 60 years of sitting with human beings who were attempting it, does not occur in comfort. It occurs in exactly the kind of confrontation that comfort has been successfully preventing. And her silence had removed, with a thoroughness that his considerable psychological defenses discovered they were not equipped to compensate for, the primary source of comfort that had been making the confrontation unnecessary. The comfort of the projection. I want to explain precisely what I mean by that, because the concept of the projection as a comfort is one that requires careful handling to convey without reducing it to something simpler and less accurate than it actually is. The anima projection is not a delusion. It is not a mistake in the simple sense of an error that could have been avoided with more careful attention or more deliberate engagement with the reality of the person being projected onto. It is a structural feature of masculine psychology that operates below the level of conscious choice and that serves, in its early stages in any connection, a genuine and necessary function. It is the interior's way of making the terrifying vulnerability of genuine encounter with another person manageable, of approaching the radical otherness of a real woman through the mediating layer of an interior image that the psyche has already made familiar, of moving toward genuine connection through the preliminary and necessary step of projected connection, which is safer because the projected image, unlike the real person, cannot surprise him. cannot be more or less than the anima has decided she is, cannot confront him with the full and unmanageable complexity of an actual interior that exists entirely independently of his own. Her communication had been keeping him in the projected connection, not because her communication was insufficient or dishonest or in any way a lesser form of her genuine self, but because its continuity had been so reliable and so consistent that his interior had never been required to move beyond the anima's version of her, to encounter the reality beneath it. The projection had been continuously refreshed and confirmed by the arrival of her words. And the refreshing had felt like knowing her, and the feeling of knowing her had made the deeper and more difficult work of actually knowing her, of encountering her real interior, with the full vulnerability that genuine encounter requires, feel unnecessary. The silence ended the refreshing, and in the ending, the projection was left exposed as a projection in a way that it had never been exposed during the period of communication. The image in his interior, no longer being continuously updated by the input of her actual presence, began to show its seams, to reveal the places where the anima's construction and the real woman's reality had never quite aligned, but had been close enough, with the continuous supply of her words to paper over the distance, to feel like alignment. The haunting that my patient described was not simply the pain of her absence. It was the specific and disorienting experience of an interior image losing its external validation and beginning for the first time to be recognizable as an image rather than as reality. And the recognition was demanding something of him that nothing in his previous experience of the connection had demanded. It was demanding that he ask what was real, not rhetorically. Not in the philosophical sense of a man entertaining an interesting intellectual question about the nature of intimate knowledge. In the urgent and uncomfortable and practically consequential sense of a man who has discovered that the foundation he believed he was standing on has less substance than he had assumed, and who must now decide, with the full weight of that discovery pressing upon him, what he intends to do about it. Whether he will allow the recognition to drive him toward the genuine encounter that the projection had been deferring. Whether he will move through the discomfort of not knowing her, of acknowledging that what he knew was the image and that the real woman has always existed beyond the image in a territory he has not yet entered, toward the more difficult and more vulnerable and infinitely more real experience of actually trying to know her, or whether he will attempt to re-establish the supply. This is the distinction I want to place before you with the full weight of its importance, because it is the distinction that determines whether what her silence has produced in him is genuine change or simply the system's attempt to return to its previous comfortable arrangement. When he reaches out in the silence, when the haunting becomes sufficiently insistent that the personals are no longer adequate to contain it, and something in him moves toward her with an urgency that the comfortable period of her continuous communication never produced. The nature of that change tells you everything you need to know about what the silence actually changed in his interior. If the reaching is oriented toward the re-establishment of the supply, if what he is seeking beneath whatever words he uses to frame the reaching is the return of her communicative presence so that the anima can resume its projection, and the comfortable distance between the image and the reality can be reconstructed, and the confrontation that the silence initiated can be successfully deferred, then the silence has produced urgency without depth, movement without transformation. The behavior of a system seeking to restore its equilibrium without doing the interior work that genuine equilibrium, as opposed to the false equilibrium of comfortable projection, actually requires. If the reaching is oriented towards something different, if there is in it, beneath the urgency, and beneath whatever imperfection of expression the persona's diminished management capacity produces in him at this stage of the interior confrontation, a quality of genuine inquiry, a reaching that is not only toward her presence but toward her reality, toward the actual and irreducible person whose silence has proven, by the weight and the persistence and the transformative force of it, that she has always been more than the projection, that she has always had an interior of her own that existed entirely independently of his anima's version of her, and that he has, in the comfortable continuity of the supply she was providing, never been required to genuinely encounter. If that quality is present in the reaching, then the silence has done what only silence can do. It has created the conditions for the first real meeting. Not the meeting that occurred when the connection began, which was real in the way that all beginnings are real, in the fresh and open and animated way of two people encountering each other for the first time, through the simultaneous excitement and projection of early connection. The meeting that the silence makes possible is different in kind from that one. It is the meeting of two people who have been through something together, who have been on opposite sides of a silence that changed the interior landscape of both of them, who arrive at the encounter, if they arrive at it at all, not with the clean slate of beginning, but with the earned complexity of people who have been required, by the specific and unsparing honesty that genuine silence produces, to examine what they had been assuming and find it insufficient and decide, with full awareness of the insufficiency, to try to build something more honest in its place. That meeting is not guaranteed by his reaching. It is made possible by it, if the reaching comes from the right interior place. And it is made possible, on your side, by something that your silence has been doing in your own interior that I want to name clearly before this conversation closes. Because the silence was not only an event in his interior, it was an event in yours. And what it produced in you, what the quiet of not reaching, not communicating, not maintaining the connective tissue of the relationship through the continuous labor of your language, what that quiet returned to you is the piece of this that matters most. It returned you to yourself, to the interior that had been so continuously oriented outward, toward him, toward the maintenance of the connection, through the generosity of your communicative presence, that it had been left with insufficient attention for its own contents, its own voice, its own unlived questions and unexplored territories, and the particular and irreplaceable quality of your own interior silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of a person who is genuinely present to themselves, in a way that continuous outward orientation makes impossible. Your silence gave you back your own interior quiet. And in that quiet, something became audible that the noise of continuous communication had been covering. The sound of your own knowing. Your own assessment of what the connection had been offering and what it had been requiring of you, and whether the exchange had been, by any honest accounting, sustainable. Your own clarity about what you are worth and what genuine reciprocity looks like, and what you are and are not willing to continue providing to a man whose interior has been consuming the supply of your communicative presence without generating the corresponding investment that a genuine and mutual connection requires. That clarity is the most important thing the silence produced, not his haunting, not his reaching, not the urgency of a man who has discovered, through the unsparing honesty of your absence, that what he had been relating to through the comfortable medium of the anima projection was less than the full reality of who you are. Those things matter, but they matter in proportion to what you carry into the encounter if the encounter occurs. And what you carry is determined not by what the silence produced in him, but by what it returned to you. It returned you to the full and inhabited reality of your own interior, to the knowledge that the silence was yours to give, and yours to end on your own terms and for your own reasons, to the understanding that genuine connection, the kind that is worth having and worth building and worth the vulnerability that genuine encounter with another real interior always requires, begins not with the reestablishment of the supply, but with two people who have each done enough interior work to meet each other for the first time, without the mediating comfort of projection on either side. You went silent, and it changed everything for him. But the more important change, the one that will determine everything that comes next, regardless of what he does with what the silence produced in him, is the one it made in you. The return to your own interior, the recovery of your own voice, the quiet discovery that you were always more than the supply you were providing, always more than the communicative presence his anima had been feeding from, always beneath the labor of the reaching and the maintaining and the continuous generous orientation of your words toward him, a person whose own silence had something to say that was worth more than everything the noise had been producing. You know what that something is, and if these words have helped you hear it more clearly today, share this with someone who is considering going silent and does not yet understand the full weight of what their silence carries. Follow along Because the conversation that matters most is always the one that begins in your own interior quiet. And yours, in the silence you created, has already begun saying everything that needed to be said.